bit about sanitation or the packing house? Yeah, everybody, right? Don't jump out of your seats or anything like that. So we're going to talk about how to manage your packing house and how many people have like a structure that they pack in for their produce. Building-wise. And so the rest of you, are you packing just out in the field and then taking and putting in bins, and basically you may be cooling stuff down, but otherwise don't have a lot going on indoors?
Yeah, I mean, we're using just like a regular like house kitchen. Like,
okay, so you're bringing it into the house? Yep, that's perfectly fine. And so the thought behind this is like as you start to grow and you grow beyond that either field packing only or doing things out of your own home, what kind of does that place need to look like as far as your packing facilities go? Yeah. And then how you might go about cleaning things. And honestly, sanitation doesn't just go for the equipment that you may be using if you get to be a little bit larger scale, but it also goes for your tools that you're using to harvest and the bins that you're packing in. So sanitation we really like to have on several different levels. So that really applies to everyone. So our learning objectives are they're going to identify potential routes of contamination associated with harvest and post-harvest sanitation or post-harvest activities. Identify the steps involved in cleaning and sanitizing food contact surfaces. So anything from a knife you're using to harvest all the way to pieces of equipment. Identify zones within a packing house. You'll start to hear people talk about zones, and you're like, what are they talking about? I mean, this isn't football. So what in the world do they mean by that? So we'll get into that a little bit. We'll talk about some of the key practices for transporting fresh produce. List key practices that need to be monitored during post-harvest activities. As far as corrective actions go, this module is actually part of what is a day-long training for the Produce Safety Alliance. So for people that have to fall under the produce safety regulation, they get this as part of their day-long training. So we're trying to break it up and make it a little bit more entertaining than it may otherwise be with some hands-on activities. And then, so that's what we're talking about with that corrective actions. What do you do if things go wrong if you have to adhere to the regulation? And then identify key records to document practices. So essentially, what we're trying to do overall is keep things clean. And we need to have continued produce safety practices by keeping things clean during harvest and after we're handling product after it's been harvested. Really, we need to think about everything that produce is going to come in contact with, from containers to equipment to your employees' hands and clothing, to water if you're using it to cool product down, and also the buildings that we may be packing in, as well as coolers, and any transport vehicles we're using to move produce around. As far as concepts go, this isn't what I like. It's not rocket science. So you can really conceptualize these things and why they're important. So we need to have good housekeeping. As far as anytime we get rubbish and debris sitting around, what is that going to attract in? Rats, right? Rats, squirrels, birds, anything that needs something to eat is going to be attracted to your packing house. So we need to get rid of that on a daily basis. And that's easier said than done sometimes, because with culls and things along those times, you're tired at the end of the day. It's easy just to leave it there, right? But you need to get those out and away from your facility. We need to provide facilities and train workers so practices are implemented properly. Again, you may be in operation of 1 or 2, so that's pretty easy to control, but as you start to grow and have more employees that come on board, it's important that everybody's on the same page. This is going to help eliminate pests and debris. As we said, anytime you have food lying around, even if it's not good to us, it's going to be like a smorgasbord for any other wildlife and rodents and insects to come in. Minimize standing water is always important. In essence, anytime you have water pooling around, it's just going to be an opportunity for bacteria, which is what I work with, going to basically give them fodder they need to grow and increase in numbers. For cleaning and sanitizing, we'll go through a 4-step process that we use for any equipment and tools, as well as our facility that we may be packing in. So for worker training, workers must never harvest produce destined for fresh market that is contaminated with feces. So that's pretty logical, right? And why is this the case if you're going to be washing? Why can't you just wash it off? Well, that's because we can't undo whatever was done out in the field. Even though it may look nice and shiny after you wash it off, you're not going to be able to take away those bacteria that may have attached there. So essentially, they just need to leave it out in the field and don't even mess with it by handling it inside the packing house. Workers must never harvest or distribute dropped produce. So in essence, if I'm growing apples, right, don't harvest the drops, right? That's something that's ingrained into everybody's head. And that is because once they fall into the ground, you may have not been managing that orchard in such a way to totally eliminate manure and feces and other things along those lines. So making sure that that crop that you're harvesting is only up on the trees. Worker health and hygiene, as far as people staying clean, include wearing clean clothing and footwear when they come into that packing house. So a lot of times they may be out in the field, they may have mud up to their knees, and it's always good to have a fresh change of boots there for them to wear in the packing house. Also follow glove, hairnet, and jewelry policies. This is what I say comes down into, this isn't going to make somebody sick, but something like a hair, or if they happen to bite in and get a piece of an earring or something like that, it's not going to make them sick, but it's going to make them possibly perturbed at you and maybe question your quality, right? This is a big catch point for people who may be looking at getting audited, because you do have to wear hats or hair nets, and you have to wear gloves when you're handling produce. For anyone else, essentially, you make up your own policies. So again, it's not going to be something that's high on my list of food safety practices. It's more so just trying to keep the yuck factor out. Using worker break areas, hand washing stations, and restrooms is also important, because we want to make sure that we have places for people to go and drink and eat that's not going to be right there where you're also packing produce. So if we're packing on these tables right here, we would want to make sure we have a separate place for people to be able to go and drink and eat their lunch and things along those lines. Restrooms is another important one. We want to make sure that people have access to restrooms and that roughly they're within a quarter mile from wherever they're having to work at. By getting beyond that point, essentially you're going to make it where they're not going to use the restrooms, right? And within those restrooms, we need to make sure they're fully stocked. And it would be something you'd actually want to use if it came to it. So not all packing houses are the same. You've been growing produce for a while. You've probably seen all different types of setups. So many of them are going to be open to the environment. They may or may not even be covered. So a lot of times people may just be packing out of like a gravel area to keep the mud away, and they just bring in their tables to pack produce when they need to. Other times they actually have what we call 4 sticks and a lid, so you do have a roof over your head, but otherwise, not a whole lot to that system. We also have some pretty enclosed places where some people pack, and essentially the more enclosed you make it, the better control you have for keeping things like birds and insects and rodents out of your packing house. So as far as reducing risk in the packing areas, we're going to want to make sure that we're trying to keep things clean. So trying to make it easy. And here's an example of a coal trash bin right there, really easily marked so everybody knows where the coals go, right? Having proper hygiene facilities. So this is an example of a hand washing sink in a packing house so that employees can wash their hands before they start packing. Here's another example of a break area where they're able to take their breaks separate from the main packing area. Keeping things organized, so here we have a bunch of tools. The one thing that's about this that I really like to see is that how are those tools oriented? Yeah, they're up off the ground, right? And they're all sitting there, they're nice and clean. They aren't sitting there with big dirt clods or anything like that on them. So they've gone through a cleaning of some sort to try and basically make sure you're not introducing dirt into your packing house when you store them away. This is a picture of a no-no. This is actually standing water right here, and here we have our container that we're packing in onto that pallet. So we're going to want to try and remove that standing water. Now, once the concrete pad is poured, the damage is done, right? You're living with whatever you have, so it's going to take basically you squeegeeing away that water at the end of the day, so it's not just sitting there in a big puddle throughout the night and things along those lines. You don't have to have a concrete pad. There's nobody that says you even have to have a building to pack in at all. What we would recommend is that you have some sort of flooring that you can actually clean, though. So that's why a lot of people move towards concrete, because it's the easiest thing to get in place. But if you're just starting out and you don't have the money to put into paying for a concrete pad and drains and all that other stuff, then I would say gravel, that's going to build up basically a nice, good barrier between you and the dirt that may come, especially if you're using water, would be the next best alternate.
I saw one that was gravel and had landscape fabric on top of it.
The landscape fabric, the question is about using things like landscape fabric. I've seen it tear up really easily. So, if you're willing to do the maintenance on it and keep it, in place as it gets worn throughout the season, and that's fine also, because again, it's just providing that barrier between the dirt and where you're packing at. Pest management's also important, especially as you start to grow in size. You're always going to want to contract with a company to actually come in and do pest management for you. And that's just, they basically set out stations where they monitor for rodent activity and things along those lines, and then can keep records to demonstrate that you don't have increased activity. And if you do, then there are actions you can take through that pest management company to get rid of the rodents. For small and medium farmers who aren't going through those auditing activities, I would say keep an eye out for it. And the best thing you can do is honestly to try and get your culls away and whatever trash and debris maybe around your packing area out and away from that and get it disposed of. You actually don't want to use bait, because bait draws in the rodents and it makes your problems 10 times worse. I've had people tell me they never had a problem with rodents until they started using baits, and then all of a sudden it was like the Pied Piper, they're being called in. So usually you use just stations to trap them and monitor them for their activity. And there's ways, like they always position the little traps like along the wall, because that mirrors where they typically like to go, up next to a wall if they're scurrying around. So they're more likely to catch them if they happen to be there. Yep. No poison, yep. Map, as far as trying to monitor things, once you get a packing house, especially once you start to grow in size, for our medium and small size packing houses, essentially we recommend that they map the flow of the produce from when it comes from the field all the way until it leaves their control. And why do you want to do this? Well, especially if you start building a packing house, we like things moving in just one direction. So we like for things to come from the field where they're going to be the dirtiest, and then as they go through the process, we're making it cleaner until they get packed out and they're transported out where they're going to be their cleanest. If I have produce crisscrossing, basically, then what I have risk of is cross-contamination. Even if they're staying separated by bins, we've had some really good examples where things like the standing water on that concrete pad splashing up and getting back onto produce. So in all cases, better if we just keep things moving in one direction from the field, going into a washing station if that's going to be needed, into a cooler, and then finally out into a pack out on the back side. You need to identify areas where produce maybe directly contact surfaces and equipment. We call this Zone 1. And then also identify other areas that introduce food safety risks, such as equipment surfaces adjacent to those Zone 1s, floors, drains. If you have condensation problems on your roof, We always like the humidity here in East Tennessee, right? So if you have areas where you have condensation, also the roofs start to be an issue for you. With our zones, they're zoned 1 through 4. And in essence, zone 1 is our food contact surfaces, and then we move out for zone 2's just adjacent to those food contact surfaces. 3 is even farther out, floors and walls and drains and ceilings. And then 4 is like the exterior of our packing house. So here's an example of a flow diagram in a packing house. And this is actually from a project that we worked on with some tomato growers in East Tennessee. So here my grad student diagrammed in where the tomatoes come in, they go to a dump tank, they go through over some PVC rollers and fans where they're dried back off. They go through a series of brush rollers, and in essence they go through sorting and boxing, and then they go into coolers, and then they're packed out from there. So in essence, this is a really good example of trying to keep things moving in one direction. The one thing I would probably recommend is that they not loop back around here, that they keep on going up through the coolers that way. So this doesn't have to be a fancy diagram, just lines on a piece of paper, especially if you're building a packing house. This helps you kind of lay out, okay, this is where I probably need to put my coolers versus where I need to put my receiving from the field. This may be a good place where if I'm going to build a loading dock or something like that to load produce out on to for market or for going to retailers. So talking a little bit more about zones within that packing house. Zone 1, again, are those product contact surfaces. So things like conveyor belts, packing bins, knives you're using to harvest, all fit within that Zone 1 category. Zone 2s are not product contact areas, but they're just adjacent to those. So if I had a conveyor belt, or let's use this table. If I was packing produce directly onto this table, then the legs down here, produce isn't touching the legs, they're supporting that, but it's just adjacent to that. So that would be an example of a Zone 2. Zone 3s are, again, once removed from Zone 2, so that tends to be our floors, our walls, and our ceilings within our packing house. And then Zone 4s finally are the areas most exterior, so our loading docks, bathrooms, locker rooms, and break rooms and offices, if we have those in our packing house. So looking at this diagram, this is a small packing line for cantaloupes, what they're packing on here, but here's just a rotary table. So the cantaloupe come off this line, and then essentially they're put on this table so that they can be packed out. So an example of a Zone 1 is going to be our packing table here. Zone 2 is the outside surface of the washer that these cantaloupes are coming out of. So the outside of this, or even right here, the support legs right here of this washer. Zone 3, again, is our floor. And then Zone 4 is essentially anything outside of that room that we're packing in. So we want you to be introduced to this terminology. And in case, as you start to grow, this is definitely the sort of language that auditors speak in. And they want to make sure that you definitely know that Zone 1s, if you have contamination there, you're going to be at a much higher risk of a bacterial foodborne pathogen making its way onto the produce you're packing. So making sure that these areas are nice and clean. And in essence, as you move outwards, your risk goes down if you have contamination. So if I have something on the floor, if I had listeria, which is a bacteria that can make people sick, on the floor, it's not quite as bad as if it was right on that packing table, right? It doesn't mean that it can't somehow get transferred up by people moving around, or when I go to clean, spraying a bunch of high pressure water and splashing it back up onto the equipment. But it's quite as high a risk as packing from that Zone 1 area. Zone 1s are the biggest concern because if they're contaminated, that produce is contacting that area, right? So if they have salmonella or E. coli sitting right on there, then there's a high likelihood that it's going to be transferred onto the produce. Your zone ones, again, are going to include your storage bins. So even if you're small and just doing field packing, you need to have some sort of cleaning regimen in place to make sure you don't have bacterial contamination occurring. And it's definitely going to include whatever equipment you're using for larger facilities. Initial efforts for cleaning should be focused on zone 1 since it has the most immediate impact on food safety. Again, your zones 2 through 4 are best managed by establishing cleaning schedules to make sure that those areas around zone 1 do not contribute to cross-contamination risk. So again, you can have something sitting in a pool of water on the ground, and that's definitely a place where we see people walking in with soil on their boots and things along those lines. You're going to have bacteria introduced there. If you don't manage that water well and clean that floor, then that whatever's in there, listeria, could be sitting around for days and could be easily transferred back up, especially in a world where we use a lot of pallets and things along those lines, and produce is fairly low to the ground. Zone 2, again, these are in really close proximity to zone 1. And again, most of the time we're talking about external support or the outside of the equipment we may be packing in. So here's an example where we're going through some brush rollers after washing, and this outside of this equipment would be a zone 2. So zone 3s are floors, walls, ceilings. In addition, you can have things like our coal bins, forklifts, phones is one that a lot of people don't think about. And honestly, anywhere where you may have catwalks or something along those lines, up and over equipment, all are usually considered zone 3s. And again, we can have harborage, especially since a lot of these, we do have soil and things along those lines coming through on the floor, where we can have bacteria building up over time, especially if we're not cleaning very well. Our zone 4s are essentially best managed by making sure we're getting rid of the trash in these areas. They don't have to be cleaned as frequently as our zones 1, 2, and 3, but it's important that we aren't leaving, you know, this looks like a slop bin right here. It's important we're not leaving that compost material. We're getting it out and away from the packing house or our coals that we may be disposing of in some other way. So we need to develop sanitation practices that reduce our risk by basically implementing or reinforcing worker training if we have someone other than ourselves working on the farm, establishing pest control programs, especially if we notice we have a rodent activity taking place, definitely cleaning and sanitizing food contact surfaces, which we'll talk a little bit more about, converting to equipment that can be easily cleaned and sanitized. You know, definitely we've seen people go through several iterations. Maybe when you first got started, you had AstroTurf, right, to try and prevent bruising and things along those lines. Well, that's not easily cleaned and sanitized. Or you're working in maybe wood or something along those lines. So having people make improvements as far as moving to plastics or stainless steel or some other sort of sealed material so that you can easily clean it and get it nice and clean and remove those bacteria that may be there. Cleaning and maintaining coolers, for those of you who are using coolers, they're a really nice harborage point because they don't see as frequent cleaning. So making sure you also have them on a cleaning regimen. And then also definitely, as Annette already mentioned, cleaning those transportation vehicles that you're packing in because they are serving double duty many times. So cleaning versus sanitizing. A lot of people think it's just one step, but in reality, it's actually two different things. So cleaning is the physical removal of dirt, which is soil, from surfaces, which can include the use of clean water and detergent. A lot of times this is nothing more than taking like a Dawn dishwashing detergent and actually cleaning down. Now, why is that important? Well, because that detergent actually is going to remove the soil and essentially leave a fairly clean surface for you to sanitize. If I don't go through that cleaning step up front and just sanitize, well, then I'm going to have remaining food debris there. I'm going to have dirt left there. And essentially my sanitizer will not work to inactivate the bacteria, which I'm really targeting with that sanitation step. So sanitizing is really treatment of that clean surface to reduce or eliminate microorganisms. So if I do happen to have salmonella or listeria hanging out in that packing bin, once it goes through that cleaning step, I'm removing that soil, and then I'm sanitizing it so that I can actually inactivate that salmonella. So it's really important that you know you cannot sanitize a dirty surface, and cleaning always has to come first. So cleaning with that detergent, rinsing off in between, and then applying that sanitizer. Now after you apply the sanitizer, you just let it drip dry. You don't have to wash off the sanitizer. You know, if you're in organic production, that is still the case. So you don't rinse that off, you just let it dry on its own. So these are just little diagrams to walk you through that. So a lot of times if you have like caked on soil, it's a good idea to go ahead and just try and remove that soil before you even start with the detergent. So getting that underway. Then you actually apply your detergent to try and remove that soil load. Rinse that detergent off. We won't want your foam sitting there and you trying to sanitize on top of that. Rinse it off. And then apply your sanitizer and let that sanitizer surface dry. We'll talk a little bit more about what types of sanitizers and how we may monitor for them in just a second. Food contact surfaces need to be non-toxic and non-absorbent. Why non-toxic? Well, because you're putting food on there, right? And you don't want to put it on anything that may leach into the food itself. It also needs to be non-absorbent, so things like plywood that's not sealed would be a good example. I've seen a lot of packing houses, right? So we try and seal any sort of wood that we may be using, or move away from wood at all and go into plastics or stainless steel. It needs to be durable and able to withstand corrosion, and it needs to be able to be easily cleaned and sanitized. Equipment should be designed and installed to facilitate cleaning and sanitizing. There's a lot of things when you really get down to it, especially with a lot of those small washers that I've seen in the past, where it's essentially an enclosed tomb, right? The product goes into the tunnel, and it's covered because people don't like being splashed with water, right? You have those jets coming down on top of it. But also cleaning inside of there is almost impossible because you really can't access that equipment. So whenever you start going to purchase equipment, you need to be really mindful of, okay, how easy is this actually going to be to clean? Things like brush rollers, I mean, they're almost like a change out every year because you cannot get them back to the same level of cleanliness year after year. The ability to remove nozzles, if you have sprays that come down, or those brushes. PVC rollers are another biggie that we see a lot in the packing houses, are all really important because at the end of the season, it's nice to break those all down and make sure they get one really great clean when they're not in use and they're off season. So that's the best case scenario. We are really knowledgeable in the fact that not everybody can go out and sink in, you know, thousands of dollars in buying brand new equipment, right? And you got what you got, right? So all hope is not lost. You still need to clean that equipment. And essentially you still need to try and maintain it as best you can. A lot of times, especially for some things, it's just sealing them so you can continue to wash them and they're not as porous. Or painting metal and things along those lines with a food grade paint and making sure it doesn't flake off between years. And making sure you have a cleaning schedule in place so you are still cleaning that equipment so you don't have what we call biofilms. If you've ever been in the dentist, they talk about, you know, the bacteria eating away and causing cavities. Well, the way they do that is actually through biofilms forming on your teeth. And the same thing happens on equipment. And the main way we can help control for biofilm formation that bacteria will produce is by having a routine sanitation schedule where we are cleaning and sanitizing every day, because essentially we're taking away the food that bacteria would need to actually grow and form that biofilm. Air dry wooden surfaces is always important after washing. That drying out is going to keep bacteria, if they're not staying wet, from being able to grow. Equipment and tools that cannot be maintained or cleaned properly may need to be just phased out of the operation. And especially if you're buying new equipment, or building new buildings, go into it with the forethought of not only having a space that meets your needs for a production side, but also from a food safety and cleanability side. When it comes to retrofitting equipment, a lot of people will augment equipment through welding and things along those lines, which I always say that growers are some of the most have some of the most ingenuity to them. But sometimes what you do may actually make worst case scenarios. In general, from a hygienic standpoint, we want everything nice and smooth. So sometimes when you put it down tack welds and things along those lines, they actually make little niche points where bacteria can grow, and they're a lot harder for you to clean. So in general, we like to stay away from 90-degree angles, and we like to stay away from little nooks and crannies. Any place where you can see dirt aggregating, it's going to be hard for you to clean. It's going to be a great place for bacteria to grow. Also on the side of trying to prevent bruising, don't put down things which cannot withstand cleaning and sanitizing, and you can actually get clean. So no carpet or anything along those lines to prevent bruising. Use some other materials in there. So a lot of the foams actually can withstand sanitizing very well. Clean harvest bins before using them. Develop practices to minimize harvest bin contact with soil and remove soil before entering the packing and storage areas. This includes risk of contamination entering packing and storage areas, organic load in the wash water, the frequency of which wash water needs to be changed, and risk when stacking produce bins on top of each other. So really trying to assess what you're doing in that packing area is really key. Regularly inspect and maintain your equipment. Essentially, you're going to want everything operating nice and steady state. That's going to help with your production also. But also changing out and having on a preventive maintenance, your conveyor belts and things along those lines, if you're using those, is really important. Always look for leaking pipes, especially when they're coming in contact with produce. And make sure that if you have employees that they know how to identify when you have issues in your packing equipment. What does that exactly look like? Only new single-use containers or clean reusable containers should be used to pack produce in. So packing containers and materials, if for your single use, they need to be stored so that they aren't contaminated. I've seen a lot of times people have them just left in the packing house during their off season. So you actually need to have them covered up where you're not going to get bird droppings or insects coming in. Cockroaches can make their way into almost anywhere. So making sure you have them nice and covered. Again, as far as pests go, if a mouse's head can fit through the hole, then they can get in. So it's really hard in packing houses, especially packing houses that don't even have walls, to say discourage pests. The best way to discourage pests is that you make sure you don't have any food residue around. So removing those coal piles and garbage every day is really key. Also, cutting the grass around the packing area. Most of the times we'll recommend having like a foot barrier of gravel around that packing area. It'll provide it's almost like the divide that rodents especially don't want to cross. So it'll do a lot to keep them out and also keep your barrier nice and clean so you don't have weeds growing up around it. Keeping produce covered is always nice also to prevent insects or something along those lines from getting into those bins. Again, once you get larger and maybe working with a pest management company, the traps will help essentially be able to monitor for rodent activity. And essentially these go along the walls, and you can see the opening right there. That actually lines up right to the wall because that would be the most likely point where they would be scurrying along and get trapped in there. Check those traps at least weekly, and you're going to want to keep records to demonstrate that. And again, never use bait inside that packing area, which we already talked about. Pallets of produce need to be stored at least 12 to 18 inches from walls. Now, this is a nice to have. A lot of people don't have that sort of square footage to sacrifice at the end of the day. But if you can, build this into, the reason is so that you can actually see around that perimeter of wherever you're storing produce at. But inevitably, usually this is in either coolers, which come at a premium for square footage. So a lot of people can't actually meet this, but if you can, by all means do it. Train all workers to report any pest problems that they see. A lot of times they're going to be your first sentinel to tell you, hey, we see this going on, so that you know you have an issue before even your traps are going to tell you anything. For cold storage areas, we're going to want to make sure the area is clean and the cooling equipment is functioning properly. There's not a whole lot of sense in trying to do something if you're not meeting those metrics. Again, also have cleaning and pest management in place in those cold rooms, because again, you are storing your finished product in there. If something goes wrong, you can contaminate a lot of product all at once. Cooling, by all means, is not required, but if you're doing it, make sure you're managing that space properly. If you're using ice to ice down produce, make sure that ice is actually of good sanitary quality. So Annette talked about making sure you have your water tested so there's no generic E. coli in that water. Same thing goes for ice. We want to make sure that a lot of times, especially for large-scale ice production, those ice machines never get cleaned out, and they actually can form all sorts of nasty biofilms in there. Ice should always be stored in clean containers. Don't ever stack boxes containing ice produce above other boxes that don't contain ice produce, because guess what? Ice is going to melt and drip down and potentially cross-contaminate. Again, with our transportation, Annette covered this really well, but make sure you have a nice, clean transport vehicle, regardless of what size you are, for transporting produce. If you're using another person to transport your produce, make sure you're looking at what they're coming and hauling away your produce in. So for inspecting vehicles, make sure as you start to grow in size that you have a checkoff sheet basically for looking at that. Some of our larger tomato growers, they say that they at least turn away 1 truck a week from just because they aren't clean, and it's not sanitary to pack their produce in there, because ultimately their tomatoes get cross-contaminated. It becomes their problem even though they didn't do anything. So they have to be very proactive on the front end. Having your standard operating procedures is a really nice basic set of instructions. The things you could develop SOPs for are monitoring for pests, preparing, cleaning, and sanitizing solutions. This one's key. Cleaning and sanitizing produce washing lines, cleaning and monitoring cold storage areas, inspecting trucks prior to loading fresh produce, and cleaning vehicles used to transport produce. So are microbial risks the only ones? Well, as a food microbiologist, I like to say yes, but in reality, no. You can also have chemical risk and physical risk to consider that are a lot of times managed within our food safety programs. Chemical hazards include things like pesticides and detergents and sanitizers, lubricants, things along those lines that you may be using, a lot of times are stored in that packing area. So making sure that they're locked away and can't cross-contaminate your produce. Train the workers on how to utilize those chemicals effectively, and keep that MSDS sheet on site in case you do have a spill or an emergency, that you know how to both give personal care as well as how to clean up after any one of those chemical spills. It's always important to only use food-grade lubricants and oils. Even your sanitizers have to be approved for being used on food contact surfaces. And again, using those non-reactive materials when we talk about food-grade materials that won't pose a issue with leaching into the product. Physical risks are usually a lot easier for people to understand. They include things like wood and metal and glass and plastic. A lot of times you may be getting these from the field, right? When you're out there tilling up things, especially root crops, anything you're using mechanical harvesting for, it's really easy to get a glass bottle thrown in the field and you all of a sudden get that into your product stream. If you're using hand harvesting, it's not quite a big an issue. Even within the packing area, though, it's always important to make sure, especially if you're using pallets or something along those lines, that you don't have these physical risks making their way into the finished product packing. So making sure you have good overhead lights so that people can see what they're packing. Always looking at your equipment if you're using equipment, because it can also contribute metal and plastics to that finished product. And also covering your packing materials so you don't have people either using them for storage of nuts and bolts or things along those lines, or things just falling into there randomly. So as far as corrective actions go, and this is again a fancy word for what do you do when things go wrong. If a food safety risk is identified in the packing area during storage or during transport, really trying to determine, has the produce been affected? Can it still be sold? Trying to determine what caused the problem and what needs to be done to correct it. And in essence, you're trying to make a decision about how unsafe is the product that I've currently packed. And in essence, a lot of times, your first loss is your best loss when it comes to food safety. Even though it hurts, you don't want to throw away that product. It's not worth your own brand name and potentially making somebody sick if there's ever a question about it. As far as record keeping goes, if you're going through the role of keeping records for things, it's important to even keep records to demonstrate that you actively threw something away and made the right decision, especially if you're going through the steps of trying to be audited in the future.
When you say to be audited, are you talking about GAP?
Yeah, gap audited, yep. And so a lot of times people, even if they're small and medium, there's a lot of retailers interested in local produce. And essentially the gap audit's going to be the main barrier for you entering into that marketplace. So really having that lined up and in place is going to be key. And usually you like to try and get your records together a year before, a growing season before you actually want to be audited. Just make sure you have all the kinks worked out, because you're going to be spending money on this to have a third party come in and actually assess your program.
Do you have a list of GAP auditors in Tennessee?
Well, for GAP auditors, we have one for the USDA GAP standards, and she's actually based in Kentucky, but it's northern Kentucky. Other auditors typically are flown in, and essentially, so it's better off if you know you're going to go through a GAP audit. You kind of team up with your surrounding growers who may actually be going through that same auditing scheme. That way you can split the cost of travel for that auditor between each other. But many people, when they're small and first getting started, the USDA audit will be the first audit that they'll go through. And many retailers will accept that audit. We actually have a fact sheet that we can email out at the end of today about what are the first steps in going through a GAP audit and what questions do you need to ask. But essentially it's kind of a negotiating between your buyer and yourself as far as what they'll accept. Yep. Some examples of when things go wrong. I think this isn't a crazy list, right? Pest infestations, clearly. Again, contamination of the packing line by blood when a worker cuts their finger on a sharp metal edge. Issues with the drains backing up into the produce handling area. This happens a lot because, again, a lot of times if you're sending especially produce down the drain, then it's going to get clogged every now and again. Really, any situation that could pose a risk to that produce that you're packing, it really falls within this corrective action area. So for record keeping, when I say if you're doing it, it's worth your while to take the extra few minutes to write it down. And on your jump drives, there are examples of records, not only for post-harvest handling, but also for many of the records you would keep for out in the field. It's in the folder titled Food Safety Decision Trees. So you already have some ready-made records that are good for you to edit and start using in your own operation. So the records you're going to want to definitely keep are those you use for cleaning and sanitizing tools and equipment, any other container. Additional records if you have a pest management program, documenting that. Building maintenance and monitoring, so preventive maintenance sort of things. Worker training on sanitation SOPs, so you're basically signing off that workers were trained that work in your packing house. Packing area and cold storage cleaning and monitoring. So if you're checking the temperature and making sure that it's at the proper temperature in that packing area or in that cooler. And then vehicle cleaning inspections prior to loading. So in summary, all packing areas, regardless of age or design, must have sanitation practices to minimize contamination risk. And you need to identify all of the food contact surfaces as produce moves throughout that packing and storage area, and really focus on keeping those surfaces, those zone 1s, clean as a first priority. Again, cleaning and sanitizing are definitely two very different things, and you can never sanitize a dirty surface, so you always have to go through that cleaning step up front. Again, food safety practices such as cleaning, general maintenance, and housekeeping and pest control need to be in place to try and reduce our risk of cross-contamination within that packing house.